The jar of preserves was the first thing Nora Calloway noticed when she walked into the Holt Creek General Store. Not because she wanted it, but because she had exactly 31 cents left in the world, and a jar of preserves cost 35. She set it back on the shelf with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned not to want things out loud. Outside, the October wind came off the Alberta foothills in long, cold sweeps that found every gap in a coat. Hers had too. She'd sewn one shut with thread the wrong color, brown against gray, and told herself it didn't matter because nobody was looking at her anyway. She was right about that. She had been right about that for the better part of a year. The town of Holt Creek was the kind of place that had a church, a grain elevator, a hotel that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wool, and not much else. Nora Calloway had arrived on the morning stage from Calgary, which was itself the end of a longer journey she had stopped explaining to people. There was no point. The explanation always ended the same way, the word widow dropping into conversation like a stone into still water, and then the ripples of pity or discomfort or the particular kind of sympathy that is really just relief that it happened to someone else. She was 24 years old. She had been a widow for 11 months. She found the notice tacked to the post outside the feed store, handwritten in the neat block letters of a man unaccustomed to asking for help. Help wanted. Cook and general housekeeper. Hayward Ranch, 4 miles east on the Pincher Road. Inquire within at Holt Creek Hotel. Ask for W. Hayward. She stood and read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket, next to the 31 cents. The man who opened the hotel room door was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said what she had expected. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years beyond. Lean in the way of men who work outdoors, with the kind of weathered face that made it hard to tell where the squint lines ended and the expression began. His hair was dark going gray at the temples. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of someone who built things and fixed things. Wide across the knuckles, with a scar along the right thumb that had healed at an angle. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her, briefly, as if checking whether someone else had come with her. "Mr. Hayward," she said. "Yes, I'm here about the notice, the cook and housekeeper position." He held the door open. "Come in, then." The room was plain. He hadn't unpacked much, a saddlebag on the chair, a hat on the bedpost. There was a small table with 2 chairs, and he gestured toward one of them, then sat in the other and folded his hands on the table and looked at her with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to take his time judging things. "You've done this kind of work before?" he asked. Yes. She had kept house for her husband, kept house for her mother before that, kept house for the minister's family for 3 months when she'd first come through Red Deer. She didn't say all of that, she said only, "Yes, there are 3 of us at the ranch. Myself and 2 hands, Pete and Avery. We eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, noon if the work's close enough. The house needs attention. The woman who was there before left in July." He said that last part plainly, without editorializing. "Is there a reason she left?" Nora asked. Something moved across his face, not offense, more like respect maybe, that she'd asked. Her mother took ill in Medicine Hat. She needed to go home. Nora nodded. "The wage is $12 a month," he said, "room and board included. It's not a large room. That's fine. I don't know that it's the right work for a young woman alone." He said it, the way someone says a thing they feel obliged to say, not the way someone says it who means to stop you. "I'm not as alone as I look," she said, which wasn't entirely true, but it sounded steadier than the alternative. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "Can you be ready in the morning?" The Hayward Ranch house was 2 stories of wood frame and determination, set back from the road with a line of bare-limbed cottonwood trees running along its south side. Behind it, the barn and outbuildings. Beyond those, pasture rolling up into the foothills until the land met the sky in a clean, indifferent line. Walter Hayward did not give her a tour. He carried her bag to the room off the kitchen, the housekeeper's room, small as promised, with a window that looked out onto the woodpile, and set it down and said, "Breakfast is at 6," and left. She stood in the room for a moment after he'd gone. There was a bed with a good quilt, a chest of drawers, a hook behind the door. Someone had put a tin cup of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. She didn't know when. She didn't ask. She unpacked her 3 dresses and her other pair of shoes and her mother's Bible, which she no longer read but could not leave behind, and she smoothed the quilt and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the woodpile. It was the first room that had been hers in 11 months. She was up at 5:15. The kitchen had been someone else's, and she had to find everything: the flour, the salt, where they kept the lard, which burner on the wood stove ran hot. She made biscuits and oatmeal and sliced cold beef from the icebox, and had it all on the table by 6. The 2 hands came in without much ceremony. Pete LaFleur was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and slow movements that turned out to be deliberate rather than lazy. Avery Strand was young, 19, maybe 20, with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be. He said good morning. Pete said nothing, but he took his hat off before he sat down, which she counted as a form of courtesy. Walter Hayward came in last. He hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin, sat down. He looked at the table. He looked at the biscuits. He picked one up and broke it and ate it in 2 bites. Then he said, "These are good." He said it to no one in particular. He said it the way he might have noted that the weather had cleared, simply, as a statement of fact, and then he reached for his coffee and didn't say anything else. She turned back to the stove so no one would see her face. The days had a shape to them. That was the first thing she noticed. A shape and a rhythm, like something you could set a clock by. 6 o'clock breakfast. The men out by 6:30. Her morning to clean and bake and get the noon meal ready, if Walter was working close. Supper at 6 in the evening, and the men brought the cold in with them on their coats, and sat and ate and didn't talk much. Pete was taciturn by nature. Avery sometimes told a story about something that had happened that day, some small thing. A colt that had spooked at a gopher hole, a fence post that had broken at the worst angle. Walter listened. Occasionally he made one dry comment that made Avery laugh, and then went back to eating. She watched, from her place at the stove or at the end of the table, and she thought, this is what a household sounds like when it's working. She hadn't been inside a working household in a long time. James Calloway had been a good man. She believed that. She still believed it, even now. He'd been a bookkeeper in Calgary, careful and quiet, and he'd loved her in the steady, reliable way of a man who doesn't say much but shows up. He'd shown up for 3 years, and then the influenza had come through in November, and he'd been gone in 4 days. And the apartment they'd been saving to buy a house from had to go back. And the savings hadn't been as much as she'd thought because he'd been sending money to his mother in Ontario without saying, and she didn't blame him for that, she didn't, but it meant she was left with almost nothing. She'd spent 11 months trying to land somewhere. Here, for the first time, felt like somewhere. She wasn't sure when she started noticing the small things. Maybe it was the 2nd week, maybe earlier. The woodbox in the kitchen had a broken hinge on its lid. She'd propped it with a folded cloth to keep it from dropping. She mentioned it to no one. 3 days later, she came downstairs in the morning to find it fixed. The hinge replaced, clean and tight. No note, no mention of it at breakfast. She looked at it for a long time before she lit the stove. Then there was the window in her room, which had a gap along one side that let the cold in at night. She'd stuffed it with a strip of the old flour sack. One morning, a week after she'd arrived, she came back to her room after dinner to find the gap sealed, properly sealed, with new caulking, neat and flat along the frame. She asked Pete about it, because Pete had been nearest the house that day. Pete looked at her with the deliberate slowness of a man choosing not to be involved. "Wasn't me," he said. "She didn't ask Avery. Avery would have said something about it. Avery said something about everything." She sat on her bed that night and looked at the sealed window and thought about a man who would fix a thing without being asked, without saying he'd done it, without waiting for thanks. Her husband had been like that. But James had been quiet about it because he was shy. Walter Hayward wasn't shy. He was something else. Something more deliberate. He saw a thing that needed doing, and he did it, and that was apparently the whole of it. By the third week, she had the kitchen the way she wanted it. The spices sorted and labeled. The bread in a rhythm, Tuesday and Friday. The preserves she found in the cellar were last year's, and good. And she started planning what needed to come up from the root cellar and when. Walter came through the kitchen one afternoon. He didn't usually, midday, and stopped. He was looking at the shelf above the stove, where she'd reorganized the tins. She waited for something. He said, "Efficient." He said it the way someone says a word they've chosen carefully. Then he got what he'd come for, a length of wire from the utility drawer, and went back out. She found herself standing very still for a moment after he'd gone. Pete appeared in the doorway, having apparently witnessed this from the hall. "That's high praise," he said, completely without expression, and disappeared again. The first real conversation she had with Walter Hayward happened on a Thursday evening in late October, after Pete and Avery had gone to the bunkhouse, and she was doing the last of the washing up. He'd stayed at the table with his coffee. She didn't think anything of it at first. Sometimes he sat a while before he went out to do the evening check. But he was still there when she was drying the last pot, and after a moment he said, "You've been here 3 weeks." "Yes. It's working out well," he said. "The house runs better." She wasn't sure if that was meant to include her in it or just describe it. "I'm glad to hear it," she said carefully. "Where were you before Calgary?" She put the pot on its hook. "Red Deer, before that Lacombe. I moved around a bit, family. My parents passed when I was young. I was married." She paused. "He passed last winter." Walter Hayward was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," he said. "It came out plain, unvarnished, no performance to it." "Thank you," she said. Another silence. The stove ticked as it cooled. "This was my wife's kitchen," he said then. Just that. As if she should know what to do with the information. She stood still and waited. She passed 8 years ago. Our daughter's in Edmonton now. Married, got 2 little ones. He looked up from his cup, and for just a moment, something in his face was more visible than usual. "I hired someone to keep the house, because Vera used to say a house without someone in it goes sad. I think she was right." Nora didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "I'll put fresh coffee on." He nodded. She put fresh coffee on. They sat for a while at opposite ends of the table, not talking about much. The winter coming. What the root cellar still needed. Whether the bay mare might foal early. It was the most ordinary conversation imaginable, and by the end of it she understood, in some careful and private part of herself, that she had not felt this ordinary, this plain and present and accounted for, in a very long time. November came in hard. Pete and Avery were out for 3 days riding fence lines before the first real snow locked everything in. And she kept the stove going and made soup and bread and had it waiting when they came back, half frozen and wordless, and watched them eat with the intensity of men who'd been cold long enough. She'd found, in the back of a kitchen drawer, a collection of seeds wrapped in small paper envelopes, labeled in a small, careful hand. Butter beans, bachelor buttons, the good carrots. She recognized a woman's handwriting when she saw it. She put them back gently in the same order. She was making pie that afternoon. Apple, from the last of what had been put up, when Walter came in from the barn, stomping snow off his boots, and stood in the kitchen doorway. He was looking at the pie. "Vera used to make that," he said. "I'm sorry. I can make something else." "No." He shook his head once, shortly. "It's a good smell." He stood there another moment. "It's a good smell to come into." He went through to the hall, and she heard him on the stairs, and she turned back to the oven. She thought, there are people who are carrying things so heavy that they've stopped noticing the weight of them. She thought, I know what that's like. There was one afternoon. She would remember it later as a marker of some kind, though she couldn't have said of what exactly, in the second week of November, when the snow had been on the ground long enough to feel permanent. She was hanging washing in the laundry room off the kitchen when she heard Avery outside, talking to someone, animated, laughing. She looked through the small window and saw Walter by the fence with a man she didn't know, a neighboring rancher from the look of him, and they were looking at a horse. Avery had come to stand with her in the doorway. "That's Mr. Houghton from the Double H," he said. "He's been trying to sell that gelding to Mr. Hayward for 2 years, and Mr. Hayward doesn't need another horse. But Mr. Houghton's wife passed this summer, and I think—" Avery stopped, thought about it. "I think Mr. Hayward keeps buying coffee at the store even though we've got coffee, because Mr. Houghton spends his afternoons there. That's my theory." She looked at Walter Hayward, standing by the fence in the snow. He was listening to Mr. Houghton talk about the horse. He had that particular kind of stillness about him, the kind that isn't indifference, but is actually the deepest form of attention. As if listening to someone was the whole of what he had to offer, and he was going to offer all of it. "He doesn't say much," she said. "No," said Avery, "but he shows up." She turned away from the window. She thought about James. She thought about a man who showed up every time, without saying much about it. She thought, maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe that's just what it looks like when someone is decent. Christmas was a small thing, and a good one. Walter's daughter, Lillian, came down from Edmonton with her husband and the 2 children, a girl of 5 and a boy of 3, and the house was suddenly, briefly, a different kind of place. Loud in a way it hadn't been. The children ran through the kitchen in the mornings, and Nora gave them dough scraps to shape. And they made things that looked like nothing in particular, and were very proud of them. Lillian Hayward. She was Lillian Sproul now, but she'd been introduced as Lillian Hayward, and Nora thought of her that way. Was a woman of perhaps 26, with her father's steady dark eyes and her mother's small, careful handwriting, Nora suspected. She came into the kitchen on the first morning and looked around it with the attentiveness of someone who knew this room well. "You've changed it a little," she said, not accusatory. "Curious. I hope that's all right. I can put things back." "No." Lillian moved to the shelf with the spices, ran a finger along the labels. "It looks like someone lives here," she said quietly. "It's been a while since it looked like that." She said it looking at the shelf, not at Nora. Nora said, "Your father speaks of your mother kindly." Lillian turned. There was something in her face, some complicated thing, that settled and softened. "He doesn't speak of her much, but when he does." She stopped, started again. She would have liked someone in this kitchen. She used to say a kitchen with no one in it goes cold. Not temperature cold. The other kind. Nora recognized the phrasing. She thought of Walter sitting at the table with his coffee, Telling her a house without someone in it goes sad. He'd been carrying his wife's words around in him for 8 years, taking them out and using them carefully in the right places. She turned back to the stove because there was no response to that which wouldn't have been too much. The children called her Miss Nora by the second day, and she let them because it was easier than explaining. The boy, whose name was Arthur, took a particular liking to the kitchen cat, a gray thing that had been on the property as long as Pete could remember and had no name, and spent a great deal of time trying to give it one. The suggestions he made were increasingly impractical. She listened to them all very seriously. Walter watched this from the doorway one evening. She didn't know he was there until she looked up and found him leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching his grandson negotiate with the cat. Something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Softer. Unlocked. She looked away quickly, back to the vegetables she was cutting. He's like Lillian at that age, Walter said. She used to name things that didn't need naming. It's a good instinct, Nora said. Naming things. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you for making this work, he said then. This week, the house. He stopped. Considered. Lillian's been happier here than she has in a while. That matters to me. Nora kept her eyes on her work. I'm glad, she said. She's easy to cook for. She eats what's in front of her. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. She'd never heard him laugh before. She filed it away carefully, without knowing why. January was the quietest month she had ever lived through, and the most peaceful. Snow on the ground from the 3rd of the month. The road to town iced over, and they didn't get out for 2 weeks together. The days were short, light at 8, gone by 4:30. And the evenings were long, and sometimes after supper, she read in the kitchen, and Walter sat at the table with the ranch accounts, and they didn't talk, but the not talking was a different kind of not talking than it had been in October. She found, in the small case he kept on the sideboard, a photograph of his wife. A woman with a round, kind face, and an expression that suggested she was trying not to smile at whatever the photographer had told her to do. She put the photograph back exactly as she'd found it. That evening at supper, she said, I found a photograph. I hope you don't mind. I was dusting. He glanced up. On the sideboard, that's Vera. Taken about a year before she passed. He looked at his plate. She was 41 in that photograph. She looks kind, Nora said. She was. He said it with the simplicity of absolute certainty. She was the kindest woman I ever knew, and I wasn't. I didn't always understand that, when I should have. He stopped. The lines around his mouth tightened slightly, and then relaxed. That's the thing no one tells you. You understand people better after they're gone, and there's nothing you can do with it. The table was quiet. Pete was looking at his bread. Nora said, I think understanding it at all is something. Walter looked at her. For just a second with that steady, weather-worn attention. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his food. In February, she started the seeds. She'd asked him about it first. She'd taken the envelopes from the drawer and laid them on the table and asked whether anyone had been using them and whether he minded if she started some of them indoors for the spring. He'd looked at the envelopes for a moment. Those were Vera's, he said. I know. I'll understand if you'd rather leave them. He was quiet long enough that she started to say she'd put them back. Then he said she'd have been annoyed if they sat in that drawer another year. So she started the seeds. She set the trays in the window in the laundry room where the afternoon light came in, and she checked them every morning after the men had gone out, and there was something in that. In tending small, fragile things that were beginning, that felt like something she had not had access to for a long time. She wrote to Lillian about it. She wasn't sure why. She had started writing to Lillian in January, Short letters, nothing significant, reports of the kitchen and the cat, and what Arthur had decided to name the cat most recently. Lillian wrote back. Her letters were funny and warm and direct in the way her father was direct, without the silence around the edges. "He's better," Lillian wrote in February. "I don't know what you've done, but the house sounds different when he talks about it. He doesn't say much, but he sounds less alone." Nora folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the seed envelopes. The mare foaled in March. Avery came in at 2 in the morning to get Walter, and she heard them go, and she stayed awake without meaning to, lying in her small room listening to the night. At 4 o'clock, she put the kettle on. At 4:15, Walter came back in from the barn with the look of a man who has seen something go right after a long time waiting. "She's fine," he said. "The foal's strong." "Sit down," she said. "I'll get you something hot." He sat. She made tea. He usually drank coffee, but she made tea without thinking, because tea was what she'd always made when someone needed to warm up slowly. She put it in front of him and sat down across the table, and they were quiet for a while, the way you can be quiet at 4 in the morning. "Avery named her already," he said. "Clover. It suits a spring foal. It does." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I didn't think she'd make it, the mare. She was slow going into this winter, but she did. She did." He looked at her. The kitchen was lit by the one lamp over the table, and outside the window the dark was just beginning to pale at its edge. "Things do," he said. "Sometimes." She didn't know exactly what he was saying. She thought she might know. She poured more tea. Spring came in like a suggestion, and then committed to itself by late April. She put the seedlings out when the frost date had passed. The butter beans along the south fence, the bachelor buttons along the front path, the carrots in the kitchen garden behind the house. Pete walked past the garden one morning and stopped and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything, which from Pete was a significant response. Avery said, "It looks like it used to look," and then seemed embarrassed by the observation and went back to work. Walter didn't say anything about it, but she came out one morning to find the garden gate rehung. It had been sagging and rubbing against the post for weeks, and the path cleared of a winter's worth of fallen branches, and the whole of the south fence around the kitchen garden replaced where 3 posts had gone soft. No mention of it. At breakfast he asked whether she needed anything from town. She said, "No, thank you." Then, "The garden looks very well this morning. Good fencing helps," he said. "Keeps the rabbits out." Pete made no expression whatsoever and refilled his coffee. One evening in May, she was cutting the bachelor buttons that had come in early. Deep blue, which she hadn't expected from the dried seeds. And she heard the screen door, and then his step on the path, and he came around the corner of the house and stopped. She was standing with a small bunch of the flowers in her hand, and she felt suddenly as if she'd been caught doing something private, though there was nothing private about it. He looked at the flowers, then at her, then at the flowers again. "They were blue," he said. "I'd forgotten they were blue. Vera's were blue." She held them out without quite thinking. "Take them," she said. "Put them on the sideboard." He looked at her hand. He took the flowers. He didn't say thank you, but he held them for a moment with a particular carefulness that she recognized as the same thing. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Yes?" He stood there. He was looking at the flowers in his hand. He was, she understood after a moment, working toward something. Working toward it the way he did most things, slowly, without hurry, choosing the right material for the job before he started. "I'm glad you answered that notice," he said. It was not a grand thing. It was a small, plain thing. She felt it land in her chest anyway, the way plain, true things do. "So am I," she said. He nodded. He went back inside. She stood in the garden for a moment, in the late light, in her dead husband's wife's flowers, in a place that had turned out, against every expectation, to be somewhere. She stayed. That was what it came down to, not a decision she made once, and then had done. A decision she kept making, quietly, every morning when she came down to light the stove, every afternoon when she checked the seedlings, every evening when she put supper on the table, and the men came in out of the cold or the heat, or whatever the season had on offer, and sat down and ate. Lillian came in the summer with the children, and this time she came into the kitchen, and she and Nora worked side by side, without it needing to be discussed, the way women sometimes can, and Arthur named the cat Ferdinand, which finally seemed to stick. The cat did not appear to object. Walter, one evening in June, standing in the kitchen doorway, he'd taken to standing there, in the evenings, in the particular way of someone who has found a place to stand, said, "Lillian asked whether you're happy here." She could have asked me. She did ask you. I think she wanted to know what I thought. He was quiet for a moment. I told her I thought you were. I didn't want to speak for you. I am, Nora said. Happy is maybe it's a big word, but yes, I am. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said, "Good," and went out to do the evening check. She stood at the stove and thought, that is the whole of it. That is exactly the whole of it. A woman who had been nowhere, had come somewhere, and had been seen, not announced, not celebrated, not rescued, but noticed, by a man who noticed things quietly, and fixed what was broken, without making a speech about it, and who sometimes stood in doorways in the evenings, because the kitchen was warm, and someone was in it. In the spring of the following year, she wrote a letter to the minister's wife, in Red Deer, who had once been kind to her, and who ran a small lending library out of the church hall. She asked whether there might be a way to get books to some of the more remote homesteads west of town, where the children were growing up without much access to them. She'd been thinking about it since winter. She'd been thinking about it, if she was honest, since she found Vera Hayward's seed envelopes in a drawer. The idea that things carefully tended could outlast the person who tended them. The minister's wife wrote back with more enthusiasm than Nora had anticipated. By June, there was a small wooden crate on the back of the supply wagon that went out west every second Friday. It held 12 books. 12 was what fit in the crate and what she could manage to rotate. The homestead children began to know which Fridays were the right Fridays. The crate was painted blue. Walter had painted it. She'd asked him if he minded, since it was his wagon, and he'd gone out to the barn and come back an hour later with the crate painted and the lid fitted with a good latch so the books wouldn't shift. He didn't explain why he'd added the latch. She didn't ask. It was, she had come to understand, simply how he said things.